They actually have the option of requesting the Department of Labor to issue a prevailing wage determination. Welcome back to Visa Vibes. I'm Emily Newman, managing partner of Reddy Newman Brown PC, and I'm here with my co-host Stephen Brown, also partner at Reddy Newman Brown. And today we're going to be unpacking the prevailing wage rules that apply to H-1B, H-1B1, and E-3 visas.
Yeah, and Emily, just to reiterate, standing invite to any congressperson, senator, and Taylor Swift, if she has not said no yet to joining the podcast. But just to kind of frame the conversation, these categories, the H-1B, H-1B1, and E3 category, are meant to fill labor shortages in specialized fields and include wage safeguards and attestations that employers have to follow, designed to support fair play and compliance. And it's not just check the box stuff. This is a big topic right now on social media, Emily. A lot of misunderstandings, a lot of thinking things are a certain way, confusing H-1B and perm. So we thought we've seen so many myths out there. Let's talk about this. Um, let's note, by law, employers must pay the required wage. But what is the required wage? We're going to talk about that. And Congress designed these categories, H-1B, H-1B1, and the E-3 visa, so that they complement the U.S. labor market, not undermine it.
All right, so all three categories use the labor condition application or the LCA in order to ensure that the labor market is complemented, not undermined. And so on this LCA, employers have to attest that they are going to pay the required wage throughout the entire period of authorized employment. What is the required wage?
Yeah, this isn't just, throw something at the dartboard and figure out what the wage. So you have two pieces that make up the required wage. You have the prevailing wage. This is what workers that are similarly employed in the area of intended employment earn in that area. So you kind of look at similar job code, similar job field in that area. That's the prevailing wage. All right. Actual wage is what the company pays to similarly employed workers at that location for the job. And you don't get to pick between the two. It has to be the higher of the two. So we're going to dive into some examples here, but you have to pay the higher of the actual wage or the prevailing wage, and that is the required wage for H-1B, H-1B1, and E-3 purposes.
So I think a lot of people think of the prevailing wage as kind of the floor and that's all I have to do. But if other workers within the company are being paid higher, that there's a different floor. You have to
Right.
actually go by the actual wage. So let's start off with how exactly do we come up with this prevailing wage? Most employers use the Department of Labor's online wage library that's published. Anyone can go to it. It's published by the Office of Foreign Labor Certification, or OFLC. It's tied to SOC codes, which we'll talk about, work location, and then these OES wage levels. The SOC code stands for Standard Occupational Classification Code. It's the system that the government came up with to basically classify workers into different occupational categories. Each code goes with specific job or occupation. Agencies use it for the Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics specifically to basically collect, analyze, and publish data about employment, wages, job trends. We see the BLS data coming out every month about unemployment rates, and
I had a
kind of a hot topic these days.
I had a client get a call from the Bureau of Labor Statistics last year, and I was like, "This kind of seems weird." And she said, "Let me just have some questions. It's our annual survey," and she sent it over, and yeah, it's very normal, and they do break it down. I mean, certain government organizations even know, our SOC codes, right, under lawyers, so it's common. It's not just this H-1B thing.
Yeah, and so with SOC codes, it really helps identify the correct occupation to match to the foreign worker's actual job duties so that the appropriate prevailing wage can be determined and that the labor condition requirements can actually be met. So, SOC code. They're super important because that really is the starting point for figuring out, am I looking at the correct prevailing wage?
Right.
Basically, you have to first start with what are the workers' actual job duties? It's not based on just title, it's what are they actually doing? You know, there are situations where maybe the employer calls somebody a programmer analyst, and there's no code for programmer analyst. So we have to look at the actual job duties to determine if that should go under software developer or should it go with computer systems analyst or programmer.
Yeah, and like you said, it looks at the duty. So it's not just, you can't sit there and say, oh, Stephen, you're an immigration attorney. We're going to put you under the SOC code for traffic cop. It's going to look at what the job duties are.
Yeah. So we actually have to look at the descriptions that the ONET provides for each SOC code. There's so many acronyms here, to find the one that most closely corresponds to the offered positions. If the duties overlap, you have to choose the one that kind of reflects the most duties. And sometimes you have to consider between two codes going with the one that has the higher
Yep.
wage to ensure, again, that we're not undercutting wages. And we can also need to look into the industry setting. An engineer in software is going to be different than an engineer in construction, for
Mhm.
example. And we have to make sure that we are not selecting an SOC code because we want a lower wage. We
Yeah.
need to make sure that it actually reflects accurately what the job duties are so that we're goal is accuracy, not trying to game the system and find a better SOC code that has a lower wage so we can undermine US workers. We're not trying to do that here.
No, and Emily, this is looked at, right? I know a lot of people, the myth is out there that these are just rubber stamp, and to a certain extent, like let's talk about that. Department of Labor does, like Department of Labor with the LCA is going to look for completeness. USCIS, who is, entrusted by Congress to ensure the LCA matches the actual position, they look into it. So even if Department of Labor approves an LCA, doesn't mean it's going to qualify for an H-1B. I mean, I could go get a LCA today if I wanted to for someone at McDonald's, burger flipper at McDonald's. That doesn't mean it's an H-1B position. And the SOC code, Emily, is important for three reasons. Because if you pick the wrong ones, a lot of things can happen. Number one, a bad SOC code could lead to specialty occupation issues. If you pick something that doesn't require a degree, that is something USCIS routinely asks about. Maybe they're not even sure. They're not 100%. Maybe they're thinking, we're not sure. Does this SOC code require a degree in a specific field? That is asked. Number two, if you pick the wrong code to game the system, or maybe you weren't sure. Maybe it was good faith. You were torn between two, and it was 50-50. You flipped a coin kind of thing. The wages were the same. So you couldn't go off the higher wage. But USCIS will ask, did you pick the right SOC code? They'll go through it and say, you listed the job duties as, A, B, C, D, E. You picked this SOC code. We think it should be another one. Explain. And they've asked that before. And then three, Department of Labor, even though the LCA is certified, and yes, that is kind of pro forma to a certain extent, they do investigate these things, okay? And if they determine that they should have been classified as a different SOC code, a higher wage level, there could be back wages and penalties associated with that. So, yes, LCAs, what was it, like 95, 98% approval rate? Because, look, typos happen, or maybe you didn't get the FEIN verified ahead of time. But it's checks on the back end with USCIS that happen. Once we have the right SOC code, the next step to determine the right wage level. And this, everybody gets all weird on this, right? This is a formula. Okay, Department of Labor put out guidance and they said, here's how you get the right wage level so you can compare it to the OES wages. You're going to start step one, identify the SOC code. We've talked about that. Once you do that, you're going to match that. You're going to put in the requirements from ONET for that SOC code about the education, the experience, stuff like that. Step two, you're going to compare the experience that the position requires, not what the employee has, but what the position being offered has, to the ONET. So you start at level one. Everything starts at level one because you can't start anywhere else than one. That's how we count. Um, and then you're going to add points where your minimum experience exceeds the range of what's on ONET. So if ONET says 2 to 3 years of experience and you need someone with five, you're going to add points to get to a higher wage level. Next, you're going to look at education. ONET is going to say this is typical. If you require a master's degree when ONET says a bachelor's degree, you're going to add a point. Okay. Um, and then specialized skills is going to be there. Add points if there's special skills, leadership roles, if they're managerial, you're going to add points to it. And so you tally all those up. You do this matrix that Department of Labor has online, and you go through and you go one, two, three, yeah, okay, count it up. You get level one for entry level positions, not individuals, entry level positions. Level two is experience level positions. Three is proficient, advanced. Level four is senior, complex, head, lead, whatever it might be. But it is formulaic.
Now, if an employer doesn't want to go through the formula themselves, or they're concerned that maybe they'll select the wrong SOC code or the wrong wage level, they actually have the option of requesting the Department of Labor to issue a prevailing wage determination. This is what's required for all perm labor certification cases, where DOL tells us what the wage is, but for H-1Bs, it's kind of the other way around. The employer can select it, or they can ask DOL to provide it. Problem with that is with H-1Bs, these short-term work visas, it's a very fast-paced environment. They need to hire someone and get them in there quickly to fill a job shortage.
Right.
And they can't wait around for months on end to get this prevailing wage determination, especially we have cap season
Yep.
when we have a 90-day filing window, we have people's status expiring.
Yeah, you can get a
Can't
prevailing
wait.
wage in 90 days.
Exactly. So, although, yes, that is an option, it's a very unworkable option.
So outside of the Department of Labor's data, sometimes, it's not always accurate. Sometimes there's areas where they said, we don't have enough data. That happens. You can rely on a private wage survey if it meets certain standards. You can't just go into the Emily Newman wage survey where everybody's paid, one number. These are true vetted systems.
Yeah, so there are two different types of private wage surveys that could be used, and they do have to meet specific DOL requirements. Um, Number one, it could be an independent authoritative survey. For these, it has to have been published within the past 24 months at the time you are filing the LCA. And the private wage survey has to provide a weighted mean for similarly employed workers in the area of intended employment. And when you're submitting your LCA, you have to use that most recent, latest published finding for that particular occupation or location. So you have these published independent authoritative surveys, or you could use another legitimate source. Well, what could that be? Could be a custom survey that the company does on its own, or third party data, but it has to also reflect that weighted average, and it has to be based on similarly employed workers in the same area, has to be based on the most recent survey, has to be accurate information using a reasonable, consistent methodology with recognized statistical standards. So you can't just use Emily Newman's survey that.
Well, and I use that as an example. I mean, if you're hiring H-1B workers, the company can't just say, oh, we've done our own survey. We're just gonna, use that. Now, if they've hired professionals and gone through statisticians. You think about a giant company with thousands of employees. Maybe that makes sense. They can, but you can't, just make up numbers on your own. So how do you vet these surveys? You look for area fit. Look for, do they have surveys for the area of intended employment, the normal commuting distance? To be frank, we used one recently, Emily, because there was something weird about the wages in Colorado. Like, they didn't get enough responses in Colorado for certain occupations. And so OLS was like, we don't know. And so people had to use private wage surveys. I think that's fixed now. You also look for industry coverage. Do they cover that industry? Are they experts in that industry? For that occupation, recency, like you said, it has to be within the last 24 months. Role, does the survey cover the duties, level, and seniority align with those that are similarly employed when you're doing that survey? Mean, median, prefer the mean. Median's acceptable. Methodology, keep details on how they do it. What are their methodologies? These survey companies out there keep this available. And then retention, keep it as part of your file, how you determine the wage.
Yeah, so ultimately, employers can't really just select a code or geography that will depress wages. They can't rely on a narrow or non-representative data set. The survey has to have credibility. If it lacks that credibility or the area is off, USCIS can question the validity of the survey, and DOL could assess back wages in the event of an investigation or audit.
And so all of that goes into the prevailing wage side. That's only half the equation. Okay. So employers also have to establish what the actual wage is and what you as the company provide as a salary to similarly employed workers at that work location.
Yeah, and so the public access file has a component that requires what we call an actual wage memo. So an employer has to actually figure out, okay, what is the actual wage that we pay for this particular position and keep it in their public access file. They have to figure out who is similarly employed, who is not, and why. They have to set what their salary ranges or salary bands are and then set out how did they decide the offered wage for this position. Once they have that determined and have, okay, this is our prevailing wage according to Department of Labor or according to our private wage survey, this is our actual wage based on what our methodology is. Again, they have to pick the higher of the two.
Yeah, and here's a big compliance note here. Regulations prohibit unpaid benching, sham arrangements, and misqualifications. And these are tracked. Like Department of Labor does investigate these. USCIS does an investigation. Employers have to pay the proper wage and ensure that that wage aligns with the job duties, the SAC codes, and the throughout the entirety of the employment while they're working. And we've talked about this before on other media that we have. You have to do that until you do the bona fide termination process, and that's a multi-step factor as well. So compliance is tracked, and individuals, workers have the ability to complain.
And, there's, a lot of people claiming that H-1B workers undercut US workers' wages and the cheap foreign labor crowd and that sort of thing. But let's look at actual examples. So let's say we look up on the Department of Labor website, and for a particular engineer, the prevailing wage is $92,000 per year, but the company's normally paying people $100,000 per year. They can't go out and hire this H-1B worker at $92,000 per year and lay off an H-1B worker or an American worker who they paid $100,000 a year. That is not allowed.
Nope.
So they actually have to pay the H-1B worker $100,000 a year, just like they would pay an American worker. And on top of that, they are paying all of the filing fees associated with that, legal fees, have all of this extra compliance. So it makes no sense for an employer to fire an American worker and hire a foreign worker that is going to cost them a whole lot
Yeah.
more. Now, the opposite is also true. So if the prevailing wage is 105,000, but you're normally paying your American workers 95,000, you've got to pay 105,000.
And that's happened before when we talk about smaller companies. I mean that look, we pay everybody this rate, no matter, the owners paid this amount, the owners, best friend is paying this amount. We just can't do, you can't do H-1B. I mean, it's that simple. You have to pay the higher of the two wages, and these can lead to major problems.
Yeah, I mean, these are not just paperwork mistakes. You can end up with a DOL investigation from the wage and hour. And once that's complete, they do assess back wages. So you have to go back and pay everybody that was not paid properly. And then they could issue civil money penalties or fines if they find that there was a repeated practice and pattern of non-compliance. And then in really egregious cases, you may be barred from being able to use the H-1B program in the future.
Yeah, and it's all about credibility. Paying the right wage pushes back on this narrative that's really out there on H-1Bs, workers and how it undercuts U.S. workers and it ensures compliance and it protects workers as well as the company. I mean, by doing things the right way, you avoid scrutiny, you avoid issues. And this, Emily, I wanted to do this one when you and I were talking because this wage conversation isn't just compliance. It's not just let's stay out of trouble. It's gonna make sure we can properly shape the future of immigration. If everybody's out there uh, doing it the wrong way and just throw a dartboard, all right, that's not what happens. But if they just pick a random wage, it's gonna drive a negative conversation. So there's a lot of debate about whether the Department of Labor's wage levels understate the real market wages, which critics say allow underpayment of H-1Bs. That's out there. The data is done by Department of Labor. Though I'm not a statistician, I couldn't tell you whether it's good or not. I can tell you that. On the other side, employers argue that formulas don't reflect the complexity of many jobs, and they can artificially inflate, based off of random data points. I mean, if I'm a small market, a small company, maybe and in Los Angeles, maybe it's a harder, but it does need to be followed.
Yeah, and it's not just about these wage tables themselves. On the policy side, hearing all of this talk of H-1Bs and wages, Department of Homeland Security has been floating this idea of using wage levels as a way to determine who gets
Right.
H-1Bs to begin with. There is a proposed regulation that's waiting before the OMB to review it that we think is planned to do a wage-based selection system for the H-1B lottery that happens every year. And so higher paying jobs, those are level 3 or level 4, could get priority in the H-1B process, which is a huge shift because it's going to be tying visa allocation directly to salary instead of just random chance.
Yeah, and I talked to a reporter today. He thinks that rule is coming very soon as a proposed rule, and this debate matters. Whether you're a tech company, a consulting company, a university, a startup, a wage system could push more towards higher dollar companies who can pay top dollars, and smaller employers, nonprofits, rural areas might be left behind. And this was something that was challenged in court the first go around, as even if it's legal, from a perspective within the INA, how it disproportionately impacts smaller companies. Now, the judge punted because Chad Wolf wasn't a lawfully acting Department of Homeland Security secretary. But this conversation is driving policy right now. So, bottom line, wages have this crossword of protecting labor, immigration policy, and business strategy. All goes in to all of this. And so if you're not paying attention and you're not doing it right, you could miss out on what's bigger than just that LCA and how it might have an impact.
So, key takeaways. Number one, make sure you're selecting the correct SOC code. That's the starting point. You need to make sure that you are selecting the right wage level if you're using those 4 wage levels of OES and the OFLC wage library, or if you're using a private survey. Obviously, make sure you're using the correct area of intended employment. You don't want to grab a wage for, some rural town in Texas when you're actually placing a worker in Houston. Those wages look quite different. And whether you're using the OFLC wage library, a private wage survey, your pay has to meet that required wage. So it's not just prevailing wage, it's also what's the actual wage. Whichever is higher, that's what we have to pay.
Yeah, and Emily, I mean, ensuring fair pay and compliance with these rules and balanced workforce practices, it benefits everybody, right? It benefits the U.S. teams, your sponsored foreign talent. It's good for the U.S. employees, good for everybody. And from a company perspective, staying in compliance is always a good thing. So hopefully you got something out of it today.
All right, well, that's it for today's Visa Vibes. We'll see you next time and be sure to subscribe.